When Nate Diaz choked out Conor McGregor on just 11 days' notice, the fight world didn't just watch, it exploded. That night, inside the octagon, history cracked wide open. One underdog moment shattered the UFC's golden boy, and suddenly, the machine had a new villain. But here's the haunting part. Nearly a decade later, the man who once set arenas ablaze has all but disappeared. And the reason why will shock you. Stay until the end, because the biggest scandal is the one nobody saw coming. Back in 2016, when Diaz wrapped his arm around McGregor's neck and squeezed, you could feel the electricity. It wasn't just a chokehold, it was a revolution. A fighter from Stockton, inked up and unapologetic, brought the UFC empire to its knees. The crowd didn't just cheer, they roared like they were part of a rebellion. Every punch Nate threw, every scar across his face, every profanity in those raw press conferences. It became proof that this man wasn't manufactured. He was real. He was chaos. He was what the sport was supposed to be. But this was just the beginning, because what came next turned Diaz into more than just a fighter. He became a symbol, a man who refused to play by Dana White's rules, who smoked on stage, cursed at executives, and brawled in the crowd if he felt disrespected. While the UFC built stars in boardrooms, Nate built his name in blood and defiance. He didn't care about being polished, he didn't care about pay-per-view points, he cared about respect. And fans loved him for it. Think about the iconic line, "I'm not surprised, Motherf RS." That wasn't just a victory speech. That was a manifesto. A middle finger to every doubter, every executive who thought he was a stepping stone, every fan who thought he couldn't hang with the so-called elite. In that moment, Diaz wasn't just a fighter. He was a movement. But here's where things get even darker. Fast forward nearly 10 years, and the rebel who once shook the system has gone silent. No octagon walkouts, no explosive press conferences, not even the unfiltered trash talk that made every headline. Instead of being everywhere, Nate Diaz is nowhere. The man who defied the UFC machine has become a ghost haunting the edges of MMA. And that silence is more terrifying than any knockout loss, because silence feels like erasure, like the sport itself is trying to bury him alive. Picture it. Highlight reels rolling on ESPN, UFC promo packages hyping the next big thing, Dana White building fresh stars for the future. But where's Nate? Where's the man who once made the biggest superstar on the planet tap out? It's as if the industry has already decided. He's expendable, disposable, forgotten. But fans haven't forgotten. Scroll through social media and you'll see it. Endless clips of his wildest moments, his blood-soaked wars, his interviews where he slurs and stumbles but speaks more truth than any PR-trained fighter ever could. People still chant his name, still argue that he deserves his spot in the Hall of Legends. And yet, the silence grows louder. So here's the real question. Was Nate Diaz's rebellion too real for the UFC to ever forgive? Was his refusal to bow to the system the very thing that guaranteed he'd be erased from its story? Or did Diaz choose this silence himself, walking away before the sport could chew him up one final time? Because make no mistake, when Nate Diaz fights, the world pays attention. But when Nate Diaz vanishes, the world starts asking questions. Who do you think is most to blame for his disappearance, the UFC's management or Nate himself? Drop your thoughts below, because this debate isn't going away anytime soon. But remember, this is only the start. Because the downfall of Nate Diaz isn't just about one fighter fading into obscurity. It's about what happens when the sport erases its rebels to protect its empire. And the most shocking part? The biggest scandal in Diaz's story hasn't even been told yet. So if you believe Nate Diaz deserves to be remembered, to be honored as the rebel who broke the system, hit subscribe. Because in the next video, we'll expose exactly what the UFC doesn't want you to hear. When Nate Diaz walked away from the UFC, it felt like the final chapter of a rebel story. The man who had choked out Conor McGregor, the man who cursed at Dana White on live TV, the man who smoked blunts at press conferences, he was finally free. No contracts, no corporate leash, just Nate Diaz, controlling his own destiny. But freedom, as it turns out, came with a price. And that price didn't come inside the cage, it came in a courtroom. Stay with me because what happened behind those closed doors may have broken the unbreakable. At first, Diaz's post-UFC life looked perfect. He was making his own rules, finally cashing in after years of being underpaid. He headlined a boxing match against Jake Paul, pocketing millions in one night. He reignited his feud with Jorge Masvidal, settling old scores on his own terms. For once, Diaz was the boss. For once, he wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for legacy. The Stockton soldier had finally won. Or so it seemed, because just when the rebel seemed untouchable, the system struck back. Enter Fanma, a company Diaz trusted, a platform he thought would help him get paid fairly. Instead, according to Nate, they stole from him.
Millions.
Money he bled for. Money he earned through wars that left him scarred, concussed, and limping. Suddenly, the fighter who once tore through the UFC machine found himself trapped in another kind of cage. A courtroom. No punches to throw. No crowd to roar. Just lawyers, paperwork, and contracts he could never outfight. Think about that. The man who built his identity on rebellion and loyalty. The man who told the world he couldn't be controlled. Now forced to sit in silence while others dictated his fate. For Diaz, this wasn't just about money. It was about principle, respect, survival. But here's where it gets even worse. That lawsuit dragged him into the very system he had sworn to destroy. Instead of calling out Dana White, instead of hyping fights, instead of living in the chaos he thrived in, Nate was stuck in depositions. Stuck in legal limbo, watching the UFC roll on without him. Watching new stars take his spotlight. Watching fans move on. And that's the part that cut deepest. Because Diaz's legacy was never about wins and losses. It was about loyalty. About never bowing to the system. About fighting for respect in a world that wanted to erase him. But this courtroom battle forced him into silence. And silence, for a man like Nate, is worse than defeat. Fans noticed. Social media shifted. The chants that once echoed through arenas grew faint. People still posted clips, still remembered the wars, but the energy was different. Instead of celebrating the rebel, whispers started to creep in. Had the courtroom finally broken the man who could never be broken? Picture it. Headlines flashing across the screen. Diaz versus Fanma. Not Diaz versus McGregor. Not Diaz versus Masvidal. No epic stare-downs, no blood-soaked wars. Just legal documents, contracts, and betrayal. For fans, it was heartbreaking. For Nate, it was suffocating. And the question lingers, was this the end of Nate Diaz's rebellion? Or just another chapter in a war that's far from over? Because if there's one thing we know about Nate, it's that he doesn't stay down. But betrayal leaves scars deeper than fists ever could. What do you think, fight fans? Was Diaz betrayed by the system again? Or did he gamble on freedom and lose? Drop your take in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. But don't forget, this story isn't over. Because while Nate Diaz fights in court, the UFC is already rewriting history without him. And the biggest twist? The sport may never let him back in. If you believe the rebel still deserves his place, smash that subscribe button. Because in the next part, we'll uncover how the UFC is quietly erasing Nate Diaz's name from its legacy.
In 2025, the scariest part of Nate Diaz's story isn't a knockout. It isn't a bad contract. It isn't even betrayal from the East. No, the most chilling part of his legacy richt nove Selense. As Selense dat veel zeer vier dan aan hy pinch, more final dan aan hy shoke. Ante tritte behint dat Selense is darker dan aan hy expected. Stai intil te end bekause wat komis net veld decide if we vir already sien Nate Diaz for the last time. Think about it. For eiers van stelt geld om Nate for Charles. Training clips from Stockton games. Rav interviews weer het kel uit aan hy weer. Walkout staat veldlike battle marches. Hy was te vechter woeter net bloot into aard aan pijn into performance. Bid nog. Nothing. No sparring voetage. No games. No wildpresskonferensie St. Pieters. Jest Wijsbush. Wijsbush of Bad Knees. Wijsbush of Old Scar staat never Jalet. Vespers staat Tima has finale done wat no opponent killed, slof Nate Diaz dov. Ante visual stelteir of 'n story. Van spot en limping trouge airports. Greinitems footage sofs hem looking teret older tannes fortuie eiers. De man wo onze flippe te bert witte bloed dripping dovnes fase no moefeslike hes karein te weiget of every waaron hes bodai. It's not just Selense, it's fragility. Bid hier is de hunting gestion, is de Selense his choice or is it forshit ipone? Bechouse voor a fichterlike Diaz, Selense is adiate sentence. His entire career was built on noise. Ten noise of Crofts hunting his name. Ten noise of pinches cracking against bone. Ten noise of Charles dat volle wet hem every weer event. Without that, wo is Nate Diaz? A legend. Or just another fichtervaring into the background. Fans are already debating. Scroll trouge maar forums aan uilsee het somme argie Nates hult bekelebrated as a hul of fame rebel, te man wo broke McGregor, te man wo brug het authenticiteit toe as sportbeeld onhype. Ottersy is legatye is slipping. Dat is name no longer belongs in God conversations. Dat Selense is a rasing hem, onderdij dat time. Antats de tragedie. Bechouse Nate Diaz wasn't just a fichter, hy was a mirror. A reflection of every inderdag wo revisit to kite. Every van wo veld overlook het, underestimated, dismiss it. When Diaz bled, fans bled with him. When hy kies het uit te sy stem, hy veld hard. Hy was never just a man. Hy was a movement. Bid mirrors vader when left in the dark. Think about the if promoreels running rig het nov. Ty heglig het neefstars, frisse fases, te net generation. Daarna wyte hy bestem as de future of de sport. Antentose slik montages, weer is Nate. Weer is de Stockton soldier wo onze soek de entire ma word. Is missing. Erasit. It's as if the if has already decided to be rai story before hy gets to vrite the final chapter. And my betats the krillest twist of all. Dat Selense isn't just about Nate's helte, or his age, or his scars. It's about a system moving forward without him. A story being rewritten while the main character is absent from the room. Bid hier is weer 'n hoop stil lingers. Bechouse if there is onything beknof, it's that Nate Diaz has never gone kaitlei. If hy time te world kent het him out, hy kame bak swinging. If hy time te side te veldend win, hy made historie. Geld te Selense simply bid te vallen before his last storm. Geld te riese, one final time, to remand te world exactly wo hy is. Or is test relate end. Taats de geestiontiaring fans apart rig het nof. Is de Stockton liggend gearing op voor one last stand, or has de Selense already won? So tel my figget fans, do hou beliefe Nate Diaz has one figget left in him. Or shall te finale walk of hy before te Selense bekomes permanent. Drop our tougets in te comments, ilo beriading tem al. Bechouse make no mistake, tes isn't just about one fichter. Tes is about legatij. About of kyklei leggens gaan vader wente machine decades to move on and if ou beliefe Nate story deserves to be remembered, to be honored, to be bejaard het dat. Subscribe button. Bechouse internet video, wil ek pose hof te if biris its rebels and Selense is de most dangerous opponent of all.